Welcome back, everyone. We've come to the policy section of the discussion. I am not Alejandro Werner. Alejandro Werner was had his flight cancelled in New York, so I'm replacing him. So just me to say something. Alejandro is the director of the Americas Institute at Georgetown, and he's joined forces with the Georgetown Global Economics Challenge Network, and we're conducting these events together. And Alejandro has done a tremendous job in putting this panel together, or these two panels. So what I would like to do now is go to the first panel, which is going to be on labour market policies in Latin America. And the participants, Santiago Levy. So would you like to come up, Santiago? And I'd like to have everybody on the stage at the same time, and so we can proceed that way. And also, if Ilian's here, it'd be good if he could come up on the stage straight away. You know, let me just, and also David's already up on the stage, hoping he can stay awake, as we all are doing. Penny, would you like to come up now and have everyone on the stage at the same time? Let me just say, if the speakers appear to be somewhat concerned, it's because at the very last minute I gave them very clear suggestions to do something which very different to what they had been planning to do. So that's my fault. And let me also then, we have a different moderator, and the moderator is Andre. So Santiago, who's going to go? Ilian's going to go first. So would you like to come up here? Sure. Okay, thank you.
Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here for several reasons. One is that INSPIR is I feel like my house. I never studied, never teach here, but I was always involved with the school, so I have quite a bit of respect and love for this school. I come here also for an invitation from Georgetown University, from Alejandro, so that's also, I would like to thank them for here. My role here is to talk about policies, and what I would like to do here is talk about the impact of informality on something that is very crucial at the moment, which is the inflation in the region, and how this informality affects the inflation output trade-off, which is basically the Phillips curve, which is essential now for how we're going to deal with this high inflation. So that's basically what I will try to do today. What I'm going to say first, just a few stylized facts on informality in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, as you know, I'm the director of the Western M. Under my responsibilities, we have Latin America and Caribbean, all the Western M. Second point, I'm going to talk about informality and the Phillips curve, the inflation output trade-off. And then I'm going to say, why is it important, the current juncture? And then I will conclude. So let's just start with the stylized facts. Here is Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the third column. And you can compare the informality in the same measure, both output and employment informality for the regions. And as you see, of course, the Latin American Caribbean is more informal than Europe, the Middle East, but not too far from East Asia, and of course Africa is more informal. When you look at the countries, there's quite a bit of dispersion. Not all informality in Latin America is the same. You do have quite a bit of informal labor in Bolivia, Honduras, and less so in some other countries. We know some of the causes of the informality, so I'm going to go show you some facts on this first. Complex taxation, excessive in some way, rigid labor market legislations in quite almost all Latin America. We do have low access to formal credit markets and low financial inclusion, although in some countries, like in Brazil, we have gone quite ahead in terms of inclusion. Low quality of human capital, that's very general. And finally, government institutions we do have low quality, at least coming from surveys of what is good quality of institutions. So let me start with quality of human capital. When you look at human capital index, this is a World Bank measure, and you compare this to a GDP informality, which is also an estimate, you see that there is a negative correlation between informality and human capital index. When you look at education, and this most of you have looked at on the PISA education rank, you see that several of the countries on the region, here you have Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, you have quite a bit of high in the ranking, and the higher the column, the worse it is because it's the highest in the ranking. And the dots are how much you spend in terms of education. And as you see, the best is you have like the OECD, where you have low in the ranking, which means better, but you spend like 5% of GDP. You see that Latin America spends quite a bit and with less results. When you look at the taxation and you don't control for formality, you tend to believe that the income, the tax wage on labor is not so bad in general for Latin America. Some countries are much higher. But when you control for the fact that you have quite a higher informality in Latin America compared to the OECD, you do see that there is quite a bit of taxation in the region. When you look at the corporate income tax, which is on the right, you also see that most of the countries have a much higher corporate income tax for their level of GDP. So human capital, excessive taxation. Now, what about labor market legislation? When you compare an index of labor market flexibility 1 to 7, this is a World Economic Forum index. 7 is the best, 1 is the worst, and you see that the labor market flexibility of Latin America, LAC, is lower than other emerging markets, clearly lower than advanced economies. And when you look at South America, it's even worse than the average of Latin America. And of course, when you do a simple exercise of correlation, you look at the countries that have more flexibility, they have less informality. So you see on on the column where you have above median labor market efficiency, you see that informality is lower. Finally, lack of financial inclusion, and here we have some measures like how many bank branches, how many ATMs, how many bank accounts, and you compare Latin America with others. To be honest, I don't like these old statistics of what is a financial inclusion, because they all are based on the data we have and how we usually compare, but in a digitalized world, you can be inclusive without having branches, quite the opposite. But I'm just reporting what we tend to report, which is in Latin America, you end up not being so bad. But when you correlate these numbers, these indices, with informality, you see a negative correlation. So which means that if you are more inclusive, you get more formality, which means less informality, which is a negative correlation. And that this is valid for the world, it's valid for emerging markets, and it's also valid for Latin America. So formality in financial markets, if you have access to credit, if you have bank accounts, tends to also be correlated with more labor formality. That's what you find in the data. When you ask people about what they believe is a good government, if the government is effective, how they like these institutions from 0 to 1. Well, the world gives us 0.88, emerging markets 0.4, Latin America a little better than the emerging markets, but still quite low. And again, when you divide the sample with the ones were above the median government effectiveness and below, you see that the below has more informality. So I'm just giving you some startlet fact and on the informality. On channels which informality can actually affect my second point, which is output inflation trade-offs. And it seems that informality, people are finding that informality in labor markets is related to the capacity to reduce inflation once you have one. And there are some channels, I'm going to give you two of them. One is the financial channel, I already mentioned that, which is the fact that if you have access to formal credit, that means that once you are in the financial system, interest rate changes actually affect you. If you are out of it completely, it's much difficult to reach it, at least directly. The other one is a labor channel. The labor channel is basically saying that if you have more flexibility for moving from formal to informal, you may have changes in terms of output gap with less movement in wages. If you only have a formal, you have less flexibility, you have more movements in wages for a given shock. So this is the startlet fact that I wanted to show you. If you have low labor informality, the output gap coefficient tend to be higher than when you have more informality. So the more informality, the flatter is the labor, the Phillips curve, which means that you have more flat Phillips curve. So if you want to see it, you can see in the graph at the right, the high informality is the one more thick line, and the low informality is the one above. So we do have the coefficient lower for high informality and higher for high informality, which means that we do have a more steeper curve. So you see that at the end, we don't find a lot of difference. So the COVID experience at the end basically made things look quite the same at the end of the period. So here is the Phillips curve, and it has been quite flat over the last 15 years. We know that's true for advanced economies. Basically, we had cycles, and inflation kept low across the cycles. So we just believed for a long time that there will not be inflation. You can actually run very low unemployment and nothing will happen. And here we are with very high employment and a very high inflation with and trying to understand what's going on. Here you see the Phillips curve steepening actually during the COVID. And it's steepened, but less than in the US. Why has this steepened? Is basically a very simple startlet fact. Inflation just shoot up while employment started to reach levels that we did not have in the past. Why is it important? Because we are basically in the very high inflation that we ever had in the last 15, 20 years. Interest rates have gone up. If these interest rates can actually make a difference, is crucial, because we can raise interest rates, we can change demand, but it may not affect inflation as much. It will depend on how steepened is the Phillips curve. What we have seen here, of course, is that you see real wages have gone down, and all this data now is for the LA5, the 5 largest Latin America. What we are calling is Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru. Those are the countries and Mexico. And here, so wages have gone down, but employment is up, and activity is up, and it is possible that with employment and economic activity index going up, we should increase wages at the moment, nominal wages. It's very hard to see this low real wages with such a high employment that will come. Well, let me just skip this. What is the risk now in terms of inflation becoming entrenched? We have, as you see in the graph on the left, this is a calculation of the coefficient, the Phillips curve, but this time around is not the output gap. It's basically the coefficient on backward looking and forward looking inflation to determine what is the inflation going forward. And as you see, lately, the lagged inflation has jumped up and the forward has gone down, and that's worrisome because it says it's going to take much more time for this inflation this time around to go down. The only thing that's good to see is that in the past, as you see, there were episodes of persistence going up, which means the coefficient on lag inflation has gone up, but it has reversed relatively fast. So it is possible that it happens again this time around. So basically what I try to convey here is that at the moment, the most important macro issue for stabilization is inflation. For inflation to go down, it's crucial what it will be the sacrifice ratio, how much you will need to raise interest rates, affect employment to reduce it, and informality seems to be a relevant factor for that. So that's basically what I wanted to mention today. So looking at informality in labor market and how it is related to the fact that you can affect inflation is crucial at the moment. Thank you very much.
So good afternoon, everybody, and pleasure to be here. Long time no been in Brazil, so it's lovely to see old friends, meet some friends that I only knew by Zoom. And I want to thank Georgetown University and, of course, Inspires for the invitation, particularly Alex, and it's too bad that Alex couldn't be here. So I guess Alex put together a session in which says, let's have Ilan talk about the macro part of informality, and Santiago maybe talk a little bit about social protection. So what I want to do is spend 5 minutes just putting together a framework in terms of how do you think about policy, trying to link the academic work that has been done by many of us and by most of you with the policy framework. So what I'm going to do now is kind of go 180 degrees from the academic literature, in which what you try to do is you try to think very, very carefully about the implications of an individual policy on an individual outcome, and you try to identify. From the point of view of policy, you need to think about the interaction between the various policies. So very, very quickly, this is not really a model, just think about it as a framework, okay? And I'm going to ignore Ilan and everything he said about macro, and just say, think about public policy in 3 broad domains, the domains by which firms and workers relate to each other. The critical point about Latin America is that this domain is really judged by the Bismarckian model, the notion that workers and firms in a wage relation contribute to a whole bunch of programs, are protected by minimum wages and very stringent job stability regulations. And I call this the Bismarckian model because it really is an inheritance from Bismarck way back then. This is imperfectly enforced in the context of the region, but very, very importantly, there are also non-contributory programs, programs that offer pensions and health to workers that are not covered by the Bismarckian regime. A second domain are taxes and transfers, and very importantly for Latin America, often overlooked, many of these taxes and transfers, particularly personal income taxes, corporate taxes, and value-added taxes, replaced in many occasions by special regimes for small firms. And lastly, market conditions, including trade, the sort of things that Penny was talking about this morning. These are 3 broad domains. I'm going to run quickly because I was asked to sort of run through my slides. So the environment in Latin America, the environment is made up of these three broad domains of public policy: how firms and workers interact, how people are taxed and transfers, and market conditions. In this environment, there are individuals. Individuals have human capital, they're capital goods. And very quickly, assume that now I'm just going to write an identity for total factor productivity. This is relevant. Simply the weighted average of the firms that are present in the market by the share of resources that are in the market. So with that, you can write income levels for the various individuals given their human capital and the social protection that everybody gets. The key idea that I want to convey is that what we observe in reality is the outcome of an extremely complex process in which factors of production, technology, and the environment are mapped into productivity and social protection outcomes. The key emphasis for Latin America is that this environment in Latin America is very, very different from the environment in developed countries. It's a very different environment, that's what I want to place emphasis on. There must be about 200 papers, that look at individual policies here, a pension program, a health program, a daycare program, a particular transfer, a particular tax, and how it impacts social protection and incomes, i.e. a huge amount of work on the impact of social protection policies on social protection outcomes. And from my experience, most policymakers in Latin America, when they think about social protection, are thinking about this particular mapping. Less often, they think about the mapping that in fact, as you're changing social protection, you're also affecting firms and worker choices along many dimensions that impact productivity. There's a lot of work. Many of the people have done this work, Rodrigo, Gabriel, perhaps myself, on this part, but from the policy point of view, most of this, in my perspective, is mostly ignored by policymakers. So with that, you can then map workers into formal and informal very quickly. Workers can be mapped by income levels and by formality status between non-poor and poor. Very importantly, and in the discussion this morning this was missing a little bit, informality and illegality are not the same thing, because in most Latin American countries, not in Brazil, but in most Latin American countries, self-employed workers and workers in a firm without a wage relation are actually not required to contribute to social insurance, so you can be informal without breaking the law. And you can be poor and you can be informal. Very importantly, there's a distinction between informality and poverty. Social insurance programs, these guys here are protected by the Bismarckian regime. These guys here are not unprotected. They are protected by a large number of non-contributory programs. This might surprise you. The average country in Latin America spends about 2% of GDP on programs here. I'm not talking about conditional cash transfers. That's about 0.5% of GDP that is spent in these programs here. But the average country here spends about 2%. Argentina 4%, Peru about 2.5%, Ecuador about 2.5%, it varies. Yeah. So in this context, social protection is going to be extremely ineffective. Workers transit between formal and informal status. You can't see this down here, is the only fact I'm going to bear a little bit. If you look at long-term data, administrative data, I have this data for Mexico for about 20 years. Workers are formal about 0.5% of the time that they're working. So the average Mexican worker was in formality about 46% of the time. With that, the observation I want to make is social insurance is going to be very ineffective. It's erratic. Most workers will not get a pension. They will not satisfy the requirements to actually save to get a pension, and they're going to get very erratic quality care. The bottom line is that this does very little to reduce income inequality. In the OECD, the whole construction reduces inequality by about 17 points. In Latin America, this construction reduces inequality by about 0.2 points. Very quickly, less noticed, this construction can hurt productivity. We spoke about firms. I'm going to skip this slide because of time. Most firms are very small, huge number of very small firms. Informal firms are less productive than formal firms. So the important point is that formality is being taxed by social protection programs because firms or workers are internalizing the cost of a large set of benefits that workers don't value at full value because quality is low, because they're not going to get a pension, and because coverage is erratic. At the same time, there are programs that are giving you benefits conditional upon being informal, not conditional upon being poor. And therefore, you're actually subsidizing. And lastly, there are all these special regimes for firms that say if you're a small firm, you can substitute your personal income tax or your corporate income tax or your value-added tax or your social contributions by a single tax, a single payment that is usually extremely generous, but it generates discontinuities in firms' after-tax functions. So from the point of view of resource allocation, what social protection is doing is this. As workers move from informality to formality, they're being taxed. As workers move from formality to informality, they're being subsidized. As firms go up in size, they're taxed, not so much because of enforcement, which is a typical thing that we think about all the time, enforcement proportional to firm size, but because the special regimes have various steps, and as firms move through the special regimes, their profits after tax are falling unless they have a big shock in the level of output. So, bottom line, the high productivity sector of the economy is being taxed and the low productivity is being subsidized. This is part of the explanation, not the only explanation, part of the explanation as to why productivity in Latin America over the last 3 decades has basically stagnated. There are many other factors. The sort of things that Penny was talking in the morning, trade will try to increase productivity, but at the same time, the social protection structure, not individual programs, the social protection structure is actually pushing resource allocation into the other side. I went really quickly. I'm going to end up by saying, under these conditions, socially inclusive growth is going to be very difficult because the policies that you're pushing through to increase the coverage of social insurance are actually counteracting partly the policies that you're pushing through to increase productivity. And the core problem is that the Bismarckian regime taxes the high productivity sector, and it's a source of exclusion because it's based on the concept of the wage-based relationship. It leaves about half of the labor force out. Governments face the dilemma, what do I do with the other half that doesn't have any social protection? I create a parallel set of programs, but as they do that, they're actually increasing the distortions that characterize the economy. I've done a lot of work for Mexico. I don't have time to talk about this. But in Mexico, I've shown that this structure generates, despite NAFTA, a country that has income divergence and productivity divergence with Canada and the US over the last 2.5 decades, stagnant productivity, and very dysfunctional fur dynamics. The selection process, the entry process is completely distorted, and that's why productivity stagnates. So I finish here, policy implications. If what we want in the region is socially inclusive growth, in the sense of growth together with people being covered by social protection, but both consistent, we have to think deeply about the structure of social protection, not individual programs again, the structure of social protection, and in my view, move towards more universalistic type programs. Penny mentioned this a little bit this morning in the context of the gig economy, but I think it's a broader issue, which is to say we have to think carefully about delinking a significant portion of social protection, not all of it, a significant portion of social protection from the formal, informal status of workers, from the labor contract, and from contractual structure of workers. This is a heavy duty, it's a deep rethink, and this is, I think, part of the challenge that we need to do if what we want in the region is socially inclusive growth. Apologies for running through so much material so very quickly, but I think I made it in the 12 minutes that I was given at the very, very last minute. So I stop here, and thank you.
Thank you, Ilan, Santiago. Let me introduce myself. My name is Andre. I'm the head of communications here at INSPIR. It's an honor to be here. I would ask Penny, if you want Penny and Card to comment on those two presentations, and then we can start conversations here. And I also invite everyone that wants to pose a question. Just the idea here is to be more informal and to have an interaction with the four. Please, either Penny, do you want to start?
So needless to say, this is a huge topic. I cannot complain. I got a lot of time this morning, and but Ilan and Santiago are supposed to talk from a policy point of view, which is even more complex, and they were given only 20 minutes. So
20 until 5 minutes before, then it became 12.
So right. So let me give some quick reactions. So let me start with Ilan's presentation first. And let me point out, I'm not a macroeconomist, and I know what I don't know. So, but I thought it was very helpful to remind us that there are macroeconomic effects. So in the morning, I talked about the fact that most policymakers are concerned about informality because of its implications for efficiency and TFP, and Santiago talked about it, taxation, and tax capacity in general, social protection and welfare of workers, but I didn't mention macro, so I think it's great that you brought this up, especially these days when we're concerned about inflation. Two quick reactions though. One about the Phillips curve. I mean, the fact is that the Phillips curve has been flat all over the world, from what I know, including the United States. And the fact is we lived through a very strange period where unemployment was very low and at the same time inflation was very low. And we had come to the point where we were debating the merits of the new monetary theory and perhaps whether we needed new macroeconomic paradigms until we were hit with the latest episode of inflation. So I think for the younger generation especially, inflation was completely out of their minds. So perhaps it's not surprising that they didn't think of talking about inflation. But another, so as Ilan pointed out, I think very, very rightly so, is the informal sector is sheltered from the direct effects of interest rate changes because it doesn't have direct access to the capital markets. There may be indirect implications, but raising interest rates is not going to directly affect their access to credit. I was less sure about the effects on the labor market, and the reason is inflation is also going to affect the real value of the minimum wage. So if the minimum wage is not indexed, then effectively the minimum wage becomes less binding. So this may have implications for informality itself. So as inflation rises, you might see more firms switching to the formal sector to the extent that the minimum wage was one of the contributing factors. There are many others, but to the extent that the minimum wage was one of the reasons that firms wanted to be informal, maybe this would induce more transitions to formality. And I think there is some experience from Brazil, from the inflationary period that speaks to these effects. But again, this remains to be seen, and I think this is an additional concern of informality in addition to everything we talked about. Regarding the issues regarding social protection, I mean, I think we are all on the same page there. The question in my mind is what do we do about this? So from a policy point of view, it seems economists uniformly believe that informality has a negative effect on growth. Policymakers seem to believe the same, but in practice it has become impossible to implement policies that reduce informality because the social cost is so very high. And so I don't want to push this point because the results I showed this morning were based on a model. But the point the model was making is that perhaps we could achieve the same productivity gains by being more open to trade rather than trying to suppress informality. And that seems politically more feasible than trying to reduce the size of the informal sector. Now, one might say Latin American countries, including Brazil, have opened up to trade, but we didn't see much of an effect. And this is also a point I made this morning. But many would point out that one problem with many Latin American countries is over the last decades, they didn't implement trade liberalization in a consistent way, in contrast to what happened in East Asia. And that's part of the explanation of why we didn't see here the many positive growth effects we saw in other countries. So yes, there is informality, but at the same time, to the extent that you're a believer in the Washington consensus type of policies, I think these policies were never fully implemented in Latin American countries. So it's not just informality, it's everything else. And perhaps, despite the bad rap that all these policies get these days, perhaps they are much more feasible than trying to reduce the size of the informal sector. So this is my first reaction, and I will turn it over to David.
David, just a second. I think you want to react to that.
Yeah, to create maybe a little bit of a discussion. So let me, on Penny's last point, I went super quickly on the last slide. But if you think about Mexico, Mexico had an extremely successful trade liberalization. We signed a free trade agreement with the US and Canada. We actually signed 13 other free trade agreements with the European Union, many other countries. Mexico exports today more manufactured goods than the sum of Latin America put together. Mexico exports 35% of its GDP. And exports and imports in Mexico are about 60% of GDP. So it's an extremely open economy. We export a very sophisticated and complex basket of goods, aeronautics, automobiles, automobile parts, electronics, a whole bunch of stuff. Trade liberalization and this fantastic growth in exports had no impact on firm informality in Mexico in 2 decades. It's actually increased a little bit. So I'm not saying that it was wrong. What I'm saying is that you cannot rely on that when at the same time the social protections structure is undermining and offsetting the productivity gains. If you look at the productivity distribution in Mexico, I didn't show it, the right tail moves to the right. And there's a few subset of very small, large firms that grow in productivity. And the left tail of the productivity distribution actually grows even more and attracts a bigger mass of capital and labor. So what happens is the productivity distribution gets opened, and because there are forces that are countervailing. Trade on one side, pushing in the direction that you rightly point out, and then social protection spending, which is increasing, pushing in the other direction because the architecture is actually flawed.
Right.
From
Can I, very
from-
quickly?
I want to.
In full agreement, so that's exactly what I showed this morning. Informality doesn't go down as a result of trade, but productivity does. And so, on average, and so to the extent that you are focused on productivity, not everything else, perhaps this is another way of going about this without trying to suppress informality. I fully agree that it's a tax on larger firms, it's a tax on more productive firms. It induces size-dependent distortions. But the question is, how do you, what do you do about this? When it has become, from a social point of view, it has proven impossible to implement policies that reduce informality.
David, do you want to jump in?
I can also react to.
Yeah, you should go. Yeah.
Okay, Ilan.
I know nothing about this topic.
So Ilan, go ahead.
Penny is quite right that we have seen a period of very low inflation everywhere throughout several decades, and despite the cycles. So the Phillips curve estimated for the US is pretty flat, for everywhere is pretty flat. So that's the first fact. Despite that, we just got a very huge inflation now. So the issue now is, where is this Phillips curve as we speak? If it just continues to be flat, it will be very costly to come down. The second status fact that we find is that the more informal economies, not in this, just this later period in general, have a flatter Phillips curve than if you're more formal. So when we're looking ahead, and we would like to have a lower cost of this inflation this time around, we may get it in the US, maybe, but if you're very informal, you have another aspect which may mean that you may have higher cost. You have to reduce demand even more if large part of your labor market is not part of the formal. So that's the idea here. But I think you're absolutely right that we don't know if the flat curve is because of that or because everywhere else it has been like that.
I want to give the opportunity to the audience, if someone wants to pose a question. Okay, Rodrigo.
Reaction to Santiago's point. I mean, I think just to put also in perspective, right? I think in some sense, it's we usually talk about informality as being the distortion, but really in economics, we talk about taxes and regulations as being the distortion. So in some sense, in very Econ 101 terms, formality is really the distortion, right? I mean, these are the firms that are paying taxes, and these are the firms that face market regulations that we want to implement for other reasons, definitely, right? And I think, but I'm mentioning this point because I think Santiago, in some sense, it's saying that they give enforcement capabilities in Latin America. Maybe it's better just to forget about formality, right? And let's disentangle totally Social Security benefits and other benefits from labor market status, so that actually everybody's formal or everybody's informal. It doesn't matter, right? To some extent, right? So if I understood. And I think that's more or less what happened, for instance, when we talk about health policies over the last 30 years, because they also followed that model. And then they became, in certain countries, not everywhere. So in the case of Brazil, for instance, it was completely decoupled from sector of economic activity and so on, which was the case 40 years ago. But I think, I mean, there's a non-trivial challenge when you're talking about, for instance, labor market policies, right? We may want to have labor market interventions for other reasons. And I think if we move in that direction, we actually give up all of those policy instruments, right? Because how can you enforce, I mean, apart from the tax base related to payroll taxes and so on, right? Firms can just always, given this design, they can always decide not to pay anything and become informal, or I'm missing a little bit a part of your story in terms of enforcement, and how can you actually achieve this kind of universal formality and together with enforcement? I don't know if I was too confused.
Can I answer?
Yes, please.
No, it's an excellent question, and it's related a little bit to what Penny said. So I went very quickly, but I said, you want to delink a good bit of social protection, but not all of social protection, right? So what bit do you want to delink? Those aspects that are risks that have nothing to do with whether a worker is self-employed or the worker works for a firm or works partly for a firm, and health, longevity risk. You clearly don't want to delink the risk of firing, work risk insurance, work accidents. So certain things you still want to continue to be linked with the labor contract, specifically those risks that are associated with being together with the firm. The rest of the risks you want to delink, and it's really a taxation issue. Because at the end of the day, what you want to do is you want to lower the tax, not on labor, this is usually said, but it's actually not accurate. You want to lower the tax on salaried labor. And you want to change the composition of taxation in which other goods that have nothing to do with labor status, like health, are actually financed from general revenues and not from a tax on salaried labor. Now, the example you made of Brazil is very relevant. Brazil is the only country in Latin America that actually has health insurance completely delinked from the labor status of workers. What most of the countries in Latin America did is, in my very quick structure that I showed there, they put about 2 points of GDP over the last 2 decades into a parallel system of health provision. So basically what they're telling workers is, look, if you're informal, you get health for free, but if you're formal, you and the firm that hires you has to pay for it. So Brazil did it right by going completely universal. The rest of Latin America doesn't have. What it has is a segmented system that is good from the social protection point of view and extremely distorting from the productivity point of view. So which way to sort of move? You have to begin to shift taxation away from taxation on salaried labor, more taxation on personal income taxes, change all these special regimes that are very, very distorting for small firms and for special self-employed individuals. And that is a path that can bring you to a context in which the formal-informal distinction becomes irrelevant, because everybody has basically access to the same sets of benefits, regardless of the labor contract. And then you can get the productivity gains. Trade in Mexico actually produced 0 productivity gains in 2 decades. 0. And I've done some productivity compositions between formal and informal firms and sort of tracking over time. The basic reason is that the productivity gains in the formal sector were completely offset by the productivity losses in the informal sector. So it was extremely costly from the point of view of growth and productivity. And we had a very, very open trade regime.
So if I was to put like, in a sense, what Santiago was discussing and a little bit what we discuss throughout the day, in a sense, the costs and benefits of being formal versus informal are kind of distorted in the region, right? Like, and it's like disproportionately costly to be formal as opposed to the benefits being low, and the benefits of being informal maybe are too high given the design, the institutional design that we have coming from different. But even if we correct that along the lines that we are discussing, if you have any positive cost of being formal, my sense is that still you will be having a lot of firms and workers being formal just because the enforcement is quite weak. And then to get at that, then I think I don't think we can tackle informality without like ultimately tackling enforcement. And then I would like to ask some reactions from you, because lurking in the background is the political economy of actually implementing these things, right? And it's, in a sense, that goes back to a comment that Penny made in her presentation that we, for example, we don't tackle the dynamics of the adjustments in the trade shock, but neither, I think, any work has tackled the dynamics of any enforcement or any formalization policy and how long it takes to get to the new steady state. And that's crucial because if that's too detached from the political cycle, then it becomes quite hard to implement these things. So like, what are your thoughts, or have you thought about like how to also align these incentives on the political arena? It's ultimately has to be how we get these things done.
Thank you. Two thoughts. On the enforcement part, it's not that enforcement becomes irrelevant. You're still going to have firm-specific taxes associated with labor, particularly for unemployment insurance and workers' insurance. No longer for health, no longer for many other things, because that's being done through sort of general revenue. But you still have to enforce the taxation structure. So I'm not saying that enforcement becomes irrelevant. I'm saying enforcement will be slightly easier because firms, rather than trying to evade 35% of the wage, now might be trying to evade 15% of the wage. And because the value to the worker of that 15% might be higher as a share of that 15% than on the 35%, so that the implicit tax is actually a lot less. So the enforcement is there. The more interesting point is kind of the political economy, right? And this is the sort of where the things bite. If you compare Latin America with the OECD country, the typical Latin American country collects 5% of GDP, 5 points of GDP less in personal income taxes than the average country, the OECD. So, yes, the political economy is you've got to shift taxation away from the labor contract into personal income taxation. There's a lot of room for that to do in Latin America. Perhaps Brazil is not a good example because Brazil is the highest tax to GDP ratio in the whole of Latin America. You guys are in the 30% range slightly. But the average country in Latin America is way below that. In Mexico, we charge 15% of GDP in taxes. There's plenty of room to increase personal income taxes. So it's changing in the composition of taxation and changes in the value-added tax. Now, the political economy. Number of people who would gain with the sort of policy that I'm proposing vastly exceeds the number of people that would oppose it. Those that would oppose it are very, very powerful, particularly talking about the very, very large firms who now you would shift taxation to personal income taxation, to dividend taxation, and to capital taxation, which currently they're not complying. And the real difficult issue is how do you put together a coalition that actually allows tax reforms that go in the direction of shifting this composition and doing what you really want to do. What you really want to do is tax the rich. In Mexico, we don't tax the rich, we tax firms. And 90% of firms are not rich. 90% of firms have 3 to 4 workers. These guys are not rich, and we're trying to tax them. And that's where the big issue is.
Very much along these lines. So to me, enforcement brings up 2 different issues. So if we think about enforcement in isolation, so without changes in policies, like the kind of policies that Santiago mentioned that would change the incentives to be formal or informal. So the first issue is from an intellectual point of view, or I should rather say from a social welfare point of view. Can we justify stricter enforcement? And what I have in mind there is if stricter enforcement means you're putting 80% of your firms out of business and you plunge people into poverty, I think this would be hard to justify. On the other hand, if you have a large fraction of the economy who are, as I said this morning, parasites, so they could be still, operating while paying taxes, their profit margins would be lower. In that case, I think it's easier to justify enforcement. That said, so that's part one. Part two is the political economy, which I think is the elephant in the room. So even if we think enforcement may be desirable in some cases, how do you implement it? And this has proven very difficult. So the next session is on this. So I think we'll have a lot to say about that. But one thing to keep in mind is that even formal firms, as we talked about this morning, even formal firms hire informal workers. So the lobby against, I think, a regime where the taxation faced by formal firms effectively becomes larger if there are no additional measures. I think that the lobby against it would be very, very strong, which is why we don't see any changes so far.
So Penny just gave me the opportunity to invite the next panel, but first I would like to ask you all guys to a warm applause to this. So thank you, Ilan and Santiago. David, if you prefer to. Yeah. And then I will invite Mauricio and Laura, please. Mauricio Cárdenas and Laura Machado.
Okay, good afternoon. I hope, please. So thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope to make a contribution of this important discussion. Can I introduce myself? Oh, I'm Laura. I'm a researcher at INSPER, but at the moment I'm working in the government, so I'm the Social Development Secretary of the State. So my interest is in discuss the bottom 10%, so poverty. I promise I will be quick, because I noticed that everybody maybe is a little bit tired. So I will start with this image. Actually, I'm going to talk about Brazil, the last 20 years. So Brazil mainly was, in 2001, a working poor country, I would say. Informality was almost, was identical to poverty. So our mainly problem was the informality. So people worked 60 hours per week. They didn't have the right of vacation and so on. So the main policy recommendation was to increase productivity of those workers. As you can see here, this graph, it's the working labor force as a percentage, as part of the adult population. So our bottom 10%, 2/3 of our bottom 10% were working. But something changed. In the last 20 years, we went to this image. So we can see it here, that we went from low wages and informality to unemployment. So now our bottom 10% is not working. And we have, I would say, a different problem. Well, of course, informality is still a problem. But for the bottom 10%, something really changed. We can see the same idea here. This is the unemployment rate. So in 2001, we had around 50% of 15% of unemployment, and now we have something like 60% of unemployment. So all this idea can be synthesized in this table. So we can see it here, that we have actually our per capita income increase. I'm only talking about the bottom 10%. So our income of this group increased, mainly because of non-worked income. So you can check here that the main reason of the increase is the government transfers that we have been doing. And we can see here that the labor income decreased, not because the wages decreased, but because they are not working, as you can see it here. So our problems is the same idea. The bottom 10% is not working anymore. The good message is that they are not that much poor anymore. So their income is higher now, but mainly because of the transfers that the government did. So why? Let me just check. No. So why this happened? So we know that in the last 20 years, we increased the minimum wages, and we know that we have a new set of programs of social protection. We have Bolsa Família, Auxílio Emergencial, Auxílio Brasil, and other transfers that government started to do in this beginning of the century. So let me just try to make some hypotheses of the reasons of this change in the face of poverty, I would say. First, to some extent, we imagine that the social protection changed the reservation salary. So I think that probably the reservation salary changed, and now the supply of workers also changed. So people have 600 reais. Maybe they won't work for less than that. So we have a problem with the supply of the workers. Probably in some extent also, as the minimum wage increase, I think we have a reduction in demand of those workers. So probably they have less possibility to work because they are more expensive now. Maybe we had some changes in technology, I don't know. I was talking last week with a woman that wanted to be secretary in a company, but this job doesn't exist anymore. We have those things in the cell phones where people can do it by themselves, so maybe technology changed, and now they have not the jobs that they can do, they don't exist anymore. And probably also our preferences changed. Maybe this generation is less interested in having a housing servant, even when they can afford for it. So, well, maybe technology and preference also changed. So now I think that I will switch to the policymaker now. I think that the question that we have to answer, it's what we have to change in our programs in the Social Security to answer to this problem of the bottom 10%. And we have a program in São Paulo called Prospera Família. The program mainly we start with this bottom 10%, and we develop a relationship with these people. I mean, we start a conversation to understand what they want and what are their plans. I think you know that those people are not working for 2 years from the moment, so they are not working for some time. So this approach is not that easy. And the main objective of this discussion is to build with them a family development plan. What is the family development plan? It's to explain to those families that they maybe in some cases the work that they were used to do, they don't exist anymore. In some cases, we need to understand what they are interested in doing and explain what are the new possibilities that they can do. And this mentor or this tutor that build this relationship with the family and is the person responsible to do this diagnosis and this family development plan is someone that understands the possibilities of the local market. So the plan that they develop is not disconnected of the labor possibilities of the municipality or of the city. And mainly the program is just the mentor, is just the tutor that developed this plan. And after that, our challenges are to engage the families and build a system of incentives that make the family stay and implement the plan that we developed together, and also track and correct the things that won't go in the way that we want with the family. We have some, as you can imagine, we have some challenges with the poor. So sometimes they don't have access to the schools, and sometimes they don't have access to our health systems and so on. So we need to adapt other things than with the plan, and that's what we are doing at the moment. So we can see it here, the engagement and incentives that's what we are trying to do at the moment, and the track and the correction of the routes are the other things that we are trying to implement at the moment. But I really think that, and I hope you can make comments on that. I really think that as we had this change, we went from low wages to unemployment. I think that this idea of developing a plan, a new plan with those families, it's an important first step to the bottom 10%. I think I passed my time, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very impressed with INSPER, so congratulations for what you have done. And I have to say, I have learned quite a bit today, so it's been a fantastic seminar. Alejandro Berner, who invited me, and I thank him for that, asked me to talk a bit about Colombia's experience with a particular lens, which is the political economy dimension. So in the previous panel, there was some reference to this. And I'd like to share with you a few thoughts, trying to connect also with the issues that have been discussed here during the day. So let me first make a disclaimer. I'm going to be talking mostly about labor informality, and in particular about the inclusive margin. This is about firms that are formal, but it's essentially intensive in the sense that these firms hire informal workers, meaning they don't pay Social Security contributions. And from today's conversation, it's clear that informality has costs and benefits. But I would say that when informality is very high, as is the case in Latin America, pretty much the costs outweigh the benefits. I mean, you can think about benefits in terms of the buffers, in terms that it's better to be informally employed rather than unemployed. But very high informality rates are associated with poverty. Wages are essentially lower in informal jobs than in formal jobs. Lack of access to credit. Ilan mentioned to us the impact that that has on the credit channel. It makes monetary policy less effective. That's an interesting dimension. Informality is also something that has costs from the point of view of inequality as well. Essentially, very high informality becomes problematic. So I'm taking the position of someone who thinks this is a problem to be solved, which is based in today's conversation. It's I think is somewhat of a strong statement. This is informality, labor informality in Colombia. This is just the urban labor market, but the trend very much applies to the total labor market. And as you can see, informality in Colombia about 10 years ago was relatively high. 51% of the employed population was informal. Informal, again, in the sense of not being, the employer not paying Social Security contributions. And it has essentially declined. There is a gap here in the surveys based on COVID, during COVID, then an increase in informality right after COVID hit, and then continued decline in informality. So I wouldn't call this a success story. It's clearly informality is still very high, but I would say at least the trend is right. So what I want to share with you is 3 policy changes. I wouldn't call them experiments because there were, there was enough support for these policies. But policy changes that I'd like to highlight, essential because I'd like to discuss not just their impact, but the political economy dimension. Well, this is essentially the same trend, but for the overall labor market. First policy change dates a decade ago, exactly a decade ago. I didn't introduce myself. I was Colombia's finance minister between 2012 and 2018. And when I came to the office, when I was appointed, the president of Colombia said, well, Mauricio, the ministry has been working on a tax reform. I generally like the ideas of that tax reform, but take a close look at it, and do whatever you think is best. That tax reform did not have any changes related to informality. So I said, this is the opportunity. This is something I had been working as an academic for the previous decade. I knew informality. For me, informality is the other side of the coin of the development problem. And reducing informality was very high up in my priorities. I called a group of friends, including Santiago Levy, who is here, right after I was appointed. The only thing, we needed to do this very fast because there was a window of opportunity to do this tax reform. Talking to colleagues, we said, well, one important aspect here is that the payroll taxes in Colombia are just too high. And payroll taxation, if you look at what was in 2008, for the employer, it was about 50% tax. So we decided to present a bill getting rid of the contributions that employers make for the health coverage of the employees. And we also erased 2 contributions that are very common as payroll taxes in Latin America. That are always earmarked for something that is good. In Colombia, it was labor training or early childhood attention programs. So we said, well, we'll get rid of this, but we need to make sure to fund in different ways these programs, because these programs are important from the point of view of social policy. And needless to say, healthcare at the same time was becoming universal in Colombia with the same coverage for formal and informal workers. So we said, well, we're going to get rid of the payroll tax for health. I'm going to pay this with general taxation, essentially corporate income taxes. So this reform had a significant implied a significant reduction in the payroll taxes, nearly 14 percentage points. So a number of studies have been made since then, doing evaluation of these changes. Many of them published in very good journals. And interestingly enough, all of them concluding that this was very effective in terms of the growth of formal employment, which is I think, an important result. I guess the main kind of like if you take averages of these results, it's about a 4% increase in formal employment, and relatively fast, which I think is also important for the political economy. Let's just make a comment here about political economy. There are clearly losers with this tax reform, and essentially the labor unions of the institutions that were going to lose these earmarks. So negotiating this was complex, and at the end of the day, it was about compensating these institutions with other sources of revenue. But since there was uncertainty about whether these other sources of revenue were going to really match the revenue that was going to be lost, a clause was established that will allow these institutions to increase their budget year after year by 2% on top of inflation. So that actually was part of the bargaining with the labor unions of these sectors, essentially the early childhood attention and the labor training programs. Second policy experiment. Santiago mentioned before this idea of the mono taxes or the simple tax regimes. So the idea here is lower the bar so that small firms, because essentially this is targeted to firms that are that have lower revenues, gross revenues. In our case, also determining the maximum square meters that these businesses actually operated with. And the concept was, let's bring the bar down with a simple tax, a mono tax, at a very low rate so that they can actually get into the tax system or the radar of the tax authority. The initial idea here was to do it for very, very small businesses, that basically businesses that made less than $30,000 per year. This did not work. Very few businesses and individuals signed up. Then, a couple years later, another tax reform raised the threshold to $700,000. And that, of course, made a big difference. And this for certain activities, more than what was previously considered. Previously was about retail and hairdressing. Now it's wider. There's actually a tax reform now being discussed in Colombia, increasing the scope of this single tax or the mono tax, including now education and health. But the general thing here is that the tax it's not just much lower than the corporate tax. The corporate tax in Colombia is 35%, but it includes many other taxes, not just the income tax. It includes, for example, the VAT or other forms of consumption taxation. And this has been effective in the sense of widening the number of firms that are registered and collecting revenues that are now significant. Now, what does this have to do with labor informality? We know that with this, some firms are going to become formal in the sense of paying taxes now, but we don't know for sure if the intensive margin of informality is going to still be there present, if they're going to continue hiring workers informally. So this is, in my way, something that has not been completed because to make this effective from the point of view of reducing labor informality, perhaps the tax base that is used shouldn't be just gross tax revenue, gross revenues, but revenues after paying the payroll. And if you do something like that, these firms are going to be perhaps more likely to hire workers in a formal way. Final policy change, enforcement. So as many other countries in Latin America, the enforcement of payroll taxation lies in the hands of the tax administration, generally speaking. So in Colombia, pretty much at the same time we decided to reduce the payroll taxation, we created a new entity which is in charge exclusively of the enforcement of Social Security contributions. So one thing is that firms pay their VAT, their corporate taxes. Another thing is to make sure that they're paying their Social Security contributions. And the effect of this, of having this institution enforcing Social Security contributions, has been reducing the tax evasion, and this is measured. What we use here is the household surveys to identify the workers, how much they should be paying, or on their behalf, the employers should be paying in terms of taxes, and that gives you like a notional, a theoretical tax revenue, and then you compare the effective tax collections. And when this institution started, it was 30%, the evasion rate, and now is about 5%, which means having an entity that is fully specialized at ensuring that the Social Security contributions are being paid is important. And what do? They essentially look at information that comes from the taxes that firms are paying, and they are, of course, claiming some deductions as they hire workers, so you want to make sure that they pay the Social Security contributions on those workers. But more than this, you have information about the banking system, you know, which transactions were made, and then you can infer the volume of activity of these employers. And you can also use, now that we were talking, Penny was talking about the digitalization as a conduit to reduce informality. So what they're doing now is they look at transactions, for example, in platforms like Mercado Libre or Facebook or platforms that exist for the trading of real estate, and you identify who's making these transactions, and you look at the sellers, and you look at the income they're reporting, and you cross that information. So people in Colombia today, and the political economy, this is very interesting, are more afraid, more concerned about requests from this institution, UGPP, than from the tax administration. And the reason is that this institution has the sanction capacity, and this institution also has a pretty significant fine. So I think enforcement is something that should be part of the equation. So let me conclude with this. I was post-COVID, because of the way the labor market was impacted, and essentially because we had this significant increase in unemployment and also in informality early on during the pandemic, was, in my way of thinking, a good opportunity to do reforms. The problems with the labor market became more apparent, more evident. So good to think about reform. So I think before governments begin thinking about what to do, it's useful to analyze the fiscal cost of different interventions and the political cost. And of course, you want interventions that have low political costs and low fiscal costs. So I would rank highly in those in that category the nudging, awareness campaigns, incentives. Of course, reducing payroll taxes when Latin America has the fiscal problem that it has today, aggravated by COVID, is very hard because you lose revenue. This is something you can do in better times in terms of the fiscal conditions. But you also have to think in terms of impact, which interventions have, you know, a fast impact and also are effective. Effective in the sense that you get more bang for the buck, and I think these monotax policies, complemented with the idea that you have to incentivize also the firms that that use the monotax, that they hire formal workers. I think it's an useful direction to go. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Ask you to react to.
I don't have much to say. I thought it was very interesting that everyone on this panel and the previous panel has much more policy experience than I do, so I think their experience is invaluable. So I think what Mauricio talked about, in some sense, reinforces something that also Rodrigo said before, that informality is not really the distortion, it's the result of distortions. And so in order to tackle it, you need to go to the source, and the source is often excessive taxation or excessive regulation. And actually, one thing we didn't mention much is bureaucracy. So you know, one number we have in our paper is that the time cost of filling out forms and complying with the bureaucracy of labor regulation in Brazil is estimated to be 5 times as high as in the United States. So I think these are things that need to be tackled if you're going to tackle the size of the informal sector. I can offer one additional data point to this discussion that comes from a different continent. So I mentioned earlier that I'm from Greece, and my home country has been characterized by a very large informal sector for many years. So we don't have the kind of data that are available for Latin American countries, and especially Brazil. So unfortunately, one cannot do rigorous analysis to see what exactly the size of the informal sector is today. But there is strong evidence that the tax revenues have increased in Greece over the past 5 to 10 years. And this is also suggestive that the informal sector is shrinking. And if you ask the question, what caused this, more than anything else, well, there was, as you know, a huge financial crisis. And as a result, Greece was forced to implement labor regulation labor deregulation that would have been impossible prior to the crisis. But also there was a strong pressure to digitalize all transactions. Everything is digital these days. And at the same time, many people were provided incentives to collect receipts. So for example, if you went to a restaurant and had dinner, you could keep the receipt, and at the end of the year, you would submit, as a customer, you would submit the receipts to get some refunds, and that incentivized people to ask for receipts in restaurants. So little things like that. But without the crisis in Greece, nothing would have happened, and you needed this major shock for change, so which I think speaks to the political economy challenges. So one question actually I had I had 2 questions, concrete questions, both for Laura and Maurizio. For Laura, so I was not clear, these top 10%, are they, when they're unemployed, do you mean in the formal sector or also informal sector? Informal, so they are completely unemployed. And then for Maurizio, so you focused on the intensive margins, right? So those firms that may be registered with the authorities, but they can still hire workers without a permanent contract. And I was often asked when I present work on informality, so given that the informal firms don't pay taxes, so they don't comply to regulation, why would any firm want to ever be formal? And to a certain extent for firms, the answer is easy. If you are informal, there is also a penalty you face. You are excluded from formal financial markets, from formal credit markets, so you cannot get credit. You cannot enter export markets. You may be caught, so there is a penalty there. But if you are registered, so if you are legal and you have access to all these channels, what's the incentive not to hire workers off the books if there is no enforcement? So I'm asking this question because we also see, I think, a tendency in many advanced countries to hire more and more workers without a permanent contract. And so, so even if one implements all these changes, all these reductions in taxes and so on, ultimately, wouldn't there be always an incentive to try to minimize, for firms to minimize their tax burden?
Yeah, and I think that's why enforcement is important. Because the other side of the coin is that you need these revenues to basically provide public goods or to reduce inequality. I mean, whatever your preferences are in terms of the uses of public finance. But enforcement becomes crucial. Now, I should say also that the creation of the single tax, the mono tax, it's not just targeting the intensive margin, because it's also about making firms that are informal, at least from the point of view of not paying taxes, be part of the tax system. So the policy, I'd say that the mono tax is a way of reducing firm informality, but if you don't complement it with extra measures, like, for example, using as the tax base not just gross revenues, but net revenues after the payment of the payroll, I think that then doesn't necessarily mean that the monotax will result in lower labor informality. So the monotax is tricky. I think it needs to be adjusted in a way that produces the desired result in terms of reducing labor informality. But you're right in the sense that the incentive to evade payroll taxes or social security contributions is there. So that's why enforcement is essential.
Any questions from the audience? Here.
So I have a fairly broad question, and whenever I write a policy evaluation paper, one thing that I'm very curious about is what was the government's original intent? Like, what was the motivation behind this policy? What market friction or externality did they think they were gonna address with this? So I think this question can apply to both of you. So in the case of the Family Development Plan, you showed us that the nature of poverty changed. And then now it sounds like it's a retraining program to bring people back into the labor force. But if as we discussed, one potential policy could be, let's shut down firms that are low productivity, low wage firms, and this can be welfare enhancing and productivity enhancing. So if the goal was to just re-employ these workers, or if the goal is to reduce poverty, like within like cash transfers or some other safety net policy be more efficient? Like, is the government considering those trade-offs? And then similarly for like simplified tax regimes, I always think that if the goal is we want firms to register, because what we're trying to do is minimize the amount of taxes that we're losing, then simplified tax regimes make sense. But if instead what we want to do is to have an efficient allocation of resources, and by allowing certain firms that maybe have incomes below a certain threshold to now, let's call it unfairly, compete with firms that were following the law all along, you create this sort of distortion. So I guess my general question is, like, what was the original intent, and were these sort of trade-offs discussed when implementing the policy?
Well, in the case of Colombia, it's clearly reduced, and I'm talking here mostly about the payroll taxation. It was clearly about reducing labor informality, incentivizing employers to generate jobs that are formal, that pay social security contributions. So lowering the taxes was the way of doing this. Fortunately, I think the results of these evaluations show that that did happen. So that goal was accomplished. Now, I would put that and the enforcement in a different category relative to the single tax or the monotax, because that's a much more difficult question to answer. What's the goal? What's the objective? Because yes, you can say it's going to make some informal firms formal, but at the same time, as it is now, it's not creating the incentive to hire workers in a formal way. And the worst thing is, by definition, by construct, these taxes prevent growth in size. And if you relate size to informality, and there is a correlation between size and informality, this is something that could generate, I guess, in the long run, a negative impact, as it will prevent the increase in productivity that associated with larger firms. So that is I think the cost benefit of the monotax is a bit more complex than the other two, than the reduction in the payroll taxes and the enforcement.
So this bottom 10%, they have the government transfers. So that's why their income is higher now. So if you understand work as a social, as a social right, they need to go back to work. And sometimes it's not exactly retraining. They already have a skill, or they have a skill or something like that, but they are not attached to the labor market anymore, and sometimes even because of the transfer. So, and they are not working for 2 years since the pandemic started. So they, the main goal of the plan is to understand the reason why they are not working. Sometimes the reason is just that they have the transfers, and sometimes the reason is that they don't understand the new labor market, and sometimes they need to be retrained. And sometimes they just need to a place to so that their kids can go to school. So the main reason, the main goal of the plan is to understand the reason and then give them what they need. So that's the plan. The main objective of the plan is to understand why before they were workers that were in the informal sector and now they are unemployed. That's the main goal.
I have one question for Mauricio and one for Laura. So, Mauricio, we have something similar here in Brazil called Simples, like your monotax in Colombia. And one thing that happened, and my question is about the political economy of that, is that we started with a low threshold, right, that increased over time. So basically, I think we might be more or less, or the plan is to be more or less about that $750,000 a year, if I'm not mistaken. Which, I mean, it's not a small firm, right? Or it's not, in terms of revenue, a small firm. Then I think that the reasons for having that is if the reason is to reduce informality, or the reason is to increase tax collection, right? I'm not sure that's the best way to proceed, as you mentioned, because the intensive margin is not taken into account because of the basis for the tax is gross revenue. So wouldn't be a VAT more appropriate for that, or trying to disseminate a VAT system, having, I don't know, a fixed proportion of the value added overall, the entire economy to be, instead of, because in Brazil we have many different, so our consumption tax it's crazy. We were discussing that yesterday, right? I mean, depending on the sector or the type of the product that you produce, you're going to have a different ICMS, which is our state VAT. So wouldn't be a way, and that goes back to our discussion to Penny this morning, if you have chains of formal firms that would have tax credit because of the VAT, wouldn't that be one way to increase formality across firms instead of using monotax, which might create other distortions as well? And the question for Laura is, I mean, you mentioned some reasons for why those people are not in the labor market, right? Could be preference, could be technology, could be the reservation wage, right? There was another one which I don't remember, or those three. Yeah, reservation wage and minimum salary. So my question is, suppose that's technology. Suppose that you go there and you learn that's basically technology, that after the pandemic, those people will not be able to be attached again to the labor market. What would be the best social policy if work is a social right?
Well, thinking about the monotax, this tax, the one that was finally implemented in Colombia, includes a number of taxes with just one payment, but not in the current form, not the VAT. So the VAT still has a different threshold, but still mandatory. So for most of these firms, they're subject to the VAT. Now the question is, should these be changed, and rather than having this tax on revenues, do something like a simplified VAT or a simplified sales tax, something of that nature? I have the impression that in the value-added tax, since it's by definition, by construct, it can tax firms that are small, large, medium, depending on what role do they play in the whole value-added chain. From an enforcement point of view, it's more difficult to do this through a VAT. But I would say that the risk with these monotaxes is that for governments and for Congresses, there is essentially no political cost, because people like the idea of having the opportunity to basically pay a lower tax than the regular general tax. So the risk is that something that is well intended becomes perverse, which I think it's the problem with these type of initiatives. That threshold tends to increase with time, and that's why I think that there will have to be some type of commitment that you don't increase the threshold, and also you don't expand in an unlimited way the scope of activities that can be covered by it. So clearly, it's a risky strategy.
I don't think in the 21st century we cannot accept that people are not retrained. So if the problem is technology, they need to be retrained and find new skills and jobs. That's I think that's the only answer, the only thing that we can do, if that's the case.
Okay, we are running out of time, so if you can go to your, and then the last one there, and then we finish.
Okay, thank you very much for the enlightening presentations. My name is Ricardo Laverde. I'm professor here at INSPER. I have one question for Mauricio and one question for Laura. For Mauricio, I just want to pivot on one comment from Santiago Levy and to explore probably what it would be your take or basically your assessment on the political economy on a major reform like basically converting the health tax that is attached to the wages in Colombia to something that comes from an income tax or a different fiscal resource. So like how feasible do you see, and what would be the window of opportunity for that reform, and if it has probably similar effects that those that were implemented before. For Laura, I'm very out of curiosity. I just wonder if you consider that probably receiving the 600 reais per month for an individual that is in poverty is also probably having the effect of basically keeping him or her out of crime, right? So or if there are some mechanisms in place to basically look if probably this is a subsidy that is actually helping the society with a positive externality.
Let me just check if I understood.
Yeah.
If the 600 reais are sufficient so
to
that
probably basically keep people out of crime or basically engaging in a criminal behavior and an activity with a negative externality.
Okay. I don't know if I know how to answer your question, but I don't think so. It's just an opinion. I don't have any evidence of that. Maybe Rodrigo has, I don't know. But I don't think so. Criminality, it's more interesting than the 600 reais, so I don't think so. No.
So on the health insurance in Colombia, so we have universal, as I said before, universal health coverage, health insurance coverage. Benefits are the same for formal and informal workers. The only difference now, as of today, is that formal workers have to pay 4% of their income. Employees pay the 4%, not employers. So we should get rid of that, because so that doesn't distort the labor decision, the employment decision. But we're not that far. We were much farther away 10 years ago when employers had to pay 8.5% of the payroll for the health coverage. But the problem's still there because there are many other benefits, social benefits, to the informal population. Mainly because informal, and you were mentioning this, informality and poverty are, they're quite related, and or at least quite correlated. So there are many social programs that you are eligible, especially cash transfers, if you're informal. So that's problematic. But not, the issue is not health, or it's less health than the other social programs.
Is a question about the policy recommendation. Last
Want to begin? Okay, so this is the last comment. So let me answer your question and also make before I answer your question, and in giving a little bit of context here, we're not going to grow out of informality. I mean, growth by itself is not going to take care of this problem. We've seen that historically. We've seen that in the comparisons that you showed us this morning. Colombia has let me give you the example of one country, had very fast economic growth in the first decade of this century, and increased informality. I don't think exports alone are going to do the trick. We've opened our economies. We have much more trade. That in itself has also not been the solution. So active policies are necessary. And that's why I put so much emphasis on these interventions that mostly are related to taxation, either from the point of view of the design of the system or the enforcement. And I very much think that that's the way to go. So you ask about social programs in general, programs to offset the problems associated with poverty and inequality, which are also pervasive in Latin America. So how to reconcile these things? I mean, how to ensure that on the one hand, you deal effectively with the problem of labor informality, but at the same time, you don't abandon these programs that are targeted to the poor. First thing, de-link them from the labor market status. Do not think about whether the person is formal or informal when you decide who's going to be the target of the program. And fund them to to a general extent, fund them with general taxes, not with taxes on salaried employees or salaried workers. Those would be my two recommendations, but you will still need social programs, interventions that target the poor, because if you wait until you solve the problem of labor informality, that's going to take too long, and you have the problem today, and otherwise, you know, our societies are going to be in permanent social unrest and social explosion. So you need to work on those social programs and essentially transfers.
Is it work? Yeah. I think you need to do, as my colleague said, you need to target on the poor and focus in this 10% that now that are unemployed, talking about Brazil. But you still have to increase productivity of the informal sector, because it also decreased. If you remember the first image that I showed, here in Brazil, we had a decline in the occupation of this informal sector, so we still need to include them, you still need to increase productivity and target on the poor. But now poverty is different, but now poverty is not a problem of not that productive workers. Now we have unemployment, high taxes of unemployment, and also the old problem of informality that is not productive. I think that's the way.
Okay, well, that was, thanks very much. That was really terrific. So can we have a round of applause for this panel? And let me just finish by saying I want to thank everybody. I mean, the participants of the two panels, they were really terrific, despite my intervention. Let me again thank Penny and David. David's a bit tired, but I hope he can. Thanks for a really terrific presentation. Thanks for both of you for coming out. Thanks for Sergio and Aureo and everyone else who was involved. And let me also say, I thank the audience, right? It's been a long day, and people have stayed engaged, and so it's been really terrific. So it's really been fantastic for me to be here, and thanks very much for the hospitality everybody has shown. Thank you.